A good day to everyone, and thank you for joining the guest lecture today. I feel very privileged and honored to be invited to the historic Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law, very specific. Historic because of the giants that have passed through that department: Thomas Mathiesen, Niels Christie, and some of our African students, like the great Oko Elechi, who graduated from your program. I'm very privileged to be invited to your department to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the department and the good work you all have been doing. The critical histories of criminology appeal to me because of the keyword critical, not just histories, but the critical aspect of historiography is what interests me most in historical analysis. And I've always done that kind of thinking and that kind of work in my own work. The use of history as a critical tool rather than as a propaganda tool. That was something that W.B. Du Bois critiqued in Black Reconstruction in America by emphasizing that the hegemonic historiography was wrong in asserting that Black Reconstruction was a complete disaster for the formerly enslaved. He went to work to show the great contributions that people of African descent made to American recovery from the Civil War by being part of the Reconstruction government administrations, especially in the South, where they initiated the idea of using public funds to support public education. Prior to the Civil War, it was only rich children who aspired to go to school, unless, of course, you won a scholarship from philanthropists, not from the government. But today, that achievement is being enjoyed even more so by white students, that is, public funding of education, than by African-American students. Whereas when this idea was being proposed, the poor whites were outraged because they thought that an educated African-American was more dangerous than an African-American with a gun in the Union Army fighting to defeat the Confederacy during the Civil War. So they burned down schools rather than allow their children to go to school alongside African Americans. And eventually they segregated the schools, and eventually the Supreme Court said they had to integrate because separate is not equal. And eventually they are still segregating using class to segregate by moving to the suburbs and making sure that Black students can go to those suburban schools because they don't live in those zip codes. In other words, what I'm saying is that when we look at the history of criminology in Africa, we should bear in mind that it's not of benefit only to Africans, that the achievements and innovations we find in Africa will benefit the rest of the world. And we're going to see why I think this is the case. So I found this forgivology as something that might be even more appropriate than penology, which is an obsession by Western criminologists and those they have influenced in the global South, who are researching what they call the punitive turn in criminology, following the work of one of my former professors, David Garland, who has theorized the origin of the establishment of criminology in UK universities, dating it back to 1950s, just like your own department. But in your own case, you added the sociology of law. I don't know if that started from the word go, or whether it started as the Department of Criminology before sociology of law was tagged onto it. In Cambridge, it's still the Institute of Criminology, where I got my Master of Philosophy. And David Gallant says that that was how criminology became institutionalized. But I've always argued with him indirectly and directly that that history, influential history of his, neglects the history of colonialism that was coming to an end in Africa from the 1950s with the restoration of the independence of Ghana, formerly known as the Gold Coast. And that omission might be part of the reason why criminology remained underdeveloped in Africa and other colonial situations, as Thomas just reminded us, that while criminology and sociology of law could be said to be booming in the former centers of colonization, they are almost completely absent in the former colonized parts of the world, or at least they were absent until counter-colonial criminology was published to alert us to missed opportunities for theoretical development and policy innovations that can come from paying closer attention to what is being done in the African world. I would like to start with our Trinidad and Tobago intellectual, Kasala Kamara, whose wonderful book I reviewed, and he gave me a copy as soon as I arrived in Trinidad. It's called A Tribute to African Civilization. Take a look at that book. It's very important for criminology because of the story that he tells about a pharaoh who faced rebellion from Damascus. Damascus was princelet of the kingdom of ancient Egypt, and a prince of Damascus decided that the people of Damascus wanted to restore their independence. And the advisors to the king said, to the pharaoh said, let's go to war, let's crush them and teach them who is the hegemon here. But the pharaoh said, no, invite the prince to come to Egypt so that we can sit down, eat, have a meal, break bread, have a drink, and find out exactly what the people of Damascus want. And the prince of Damascus was invited. He went to Egypt, and the pharaoh asked, what do you people want? They said, we want to rule ourselves. And the pharaoh said, okay, you can go home now and tell your people that you have your independence. You can rule yourself. That was the end of a potentially volatile situation that could have led to war and the destruction of many lives. But it was just ended at a conference table after a dinner. You're now independent. Bye-bye. Can you imagine such a scenario happening today? We have a similar situation in the Bible. If you have read the Bible, you will notice that Moses, who had killed law enforcement officers and escaped into exile, returned boldly to the Pharaoh to say, let my people go. That is incredible, because if Osama bin Laden ever came to the US and went to the White House to say, let my people go, he would be in Guantanamo Bay today. But what did the Pharaoh do in the case of old Moses? He said, okay, you guys can go. Bye-bye. right? That's an indication that the African tradition of forgiveness rather than punitiveness is an old tradition that predates the modern system of criminal justice. Alatas has been doing similar research in Asia to show that intellectual colonialism or intellectual imperialism is part of imperialism. And we, as scholars, criminologists, and sociologists of law, should not focus exclusively on the economic aspects of imperialism. Because, as Steve Biko once said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So that if we free ourselves politically and even economically, but the oppressor is still ruling our minds, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o reminded us, then we will remain colonized mentally. So we must free ourselves from mental slavery, Bob Marley declared. This tradition of originality in the resolution of criminal deviance without resorting to punishment can be found even further back, thousands of years before there was anybody called Moses. Africans had written reports or stories like that of the peasant who lost his goods to an official of the government in ancient Egypt, the narrative of the eloquent peasant. And what the peasant wanted was just to get his goods back. He wasn't seeking punishment or the death penalty or any other such obsessions that you find with the criminal justice system of control freak states in a control freak world defined by imperialism. Maulana Karenga analyzed that in Ma'at, the moral ideal in ancient Egypt, a study in classical African ethics. And Molefi Asante also has published some findings about the validity of Ma'at as a system of morality, not based on punishment, but based on ethical interrelationship in our societies. Jacques Derrida, who was born in Africa and who identified as an African until his death, decided to look at this issue of forgiveness of the unforgivable, although he simply titled it Unforgiveness, to show that it is mistaken to attribute forgiveness to the religions of the book, the Abrahamic traditions, because according to Derrida, each of those Abrahamic religions of the book teaches the followers to be forgiving of their fellow human beings so that on Judgment Day, God will also forgive them their own sins. But he found that in each of those religions, there is always a proviso that says, except for that which is unforgivable. And Derrida said that, well, if you only forgive that which is forgivable, then it's no big deal. The true test of forgiveness is the forgiveness of the unforgivable. But when the Jews say their Yom Kippur prayers to forgive their brothers and ask for forgiveness, they always add the kicker. except for that which is unforgivable. When the Christians pray for forgiveness, they also pray for Holy Ghost fire to come in the book of Revelations to punish wicked people. And to Islam, forgiveness is required by followers so that on Judgment Day, Allah would also forgive them their own sins, except they keep repeating those sins or crimes for which then there will be no forgiveness. But in the Africana traditions, historically, there is no such thing as the unforgivable, because Africans appear to be willing to forgive almost everything. Look how long the kidnapping and human trafficking of Africans lasted. For 400 years or more, millions of Africans were kidnapped, killed, or transported to the New World by Europeans. And Africans are not looking for revenge or punishment. They're asking for reparative justice, right? So according to Derrida, Africans are more forgiving of the unforgivable. Also, given the way that they responded to the crimes of apartheid, not by imposing a regime of punitive justice against the architects of apartheid, but by instituting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And maybe I would like to add that maybe something is missing from that formula of TRC, and that missing element is justice. That the people who suffered under apartheid are still demanding for reparative justice. That was not included in Truth and Reconciliation. Desmond Tutu, who was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was probably responding to Derrida on forgiveness when he wrote with his daughter Mfo the book of Forgiving. And he said in that book that under the philosophy of Ubuntu, there is no such thing as the unforgivable. That under Ubuntu, everything is forgivable and everyone has something to be forgiven. And it's not for the benefit of the offender exclusively, it is also for the benefit of the victimized, who will then free themselves from mental slavery and intellectual colonialism by forgiving and moving forward. I would agree with Tutu, but we still need to demand for justice, not in the form of punishment, but in the form of reparations. So if we go back and look at the history of colonialism in Africa, although it lasted for about 70 years, a lot of harm was done across Africa through what Onyozili calls gunboat criminology, or what the Europeans call punitive expeditions. If any European was hurt in Africa, then the whole village, the whole town, the whole area would be invaded by the locusts of colonialism, and lots of people would be massacred as revenge, as punishment. That was what happened to Igbo and Ibibio women who were protesting against taxation without representation under the colonial rule, and dozens of them were massacred. Nnamdi Azikiwe wrote an article in The Crisis, edited by W.B. Du Bois in 1930, condemning the massacre of innocent women by the British colonizers in Nigeria. Those massacres are common in the history of colonialism across Africa. But that's not the kind of criminology that we want to have in Africa, gunboat criminology. We want to, as the African Union Commission puts it, silence those guns. We want to silence those guns and invest more in nonviolent dispute resolution. We can be resentful towards the Europeans, but what good is that going to do to us? According to Nelson Mandela, resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. So we may not punish the Europeans because we lack the power to punish the Europeans, and we're not interested in punishment per se because, as Derrida observed, African cultures tend to be more forgiving. But that's a lesson for the paradigm of semiology being developed by Steve Toons, Victoria Canning, Paddy Hilliard, and Monish and others, looking at violence at the borders of Europe and North America, where immigrants are subjected to very dangerous conditions that lead to the death of many immigrants. And semiology is not looking for somebody to punish, but looking for ways to prevent those deaths in custody, deaths at the borders, deaths at the factories, deaths even at places of residence, like the Tower fire in London that happened recently. Semiology might be a good paradigm for criminology in Africa to adopt and radicalize by using it to also address the crimes of imperialism more than the semiologists tend to be doing at the moment. Forgiveness liberates us, or liberates the soul, according to Mandela. It removes fear. That's why it's such a powerful weapon, according to Mandela. So instead of seeking to punish, why don't we begin to abolish punishment the way South Africa under Nelson Mandela abolished punishment, abolished the capital punishment and legalized same-sex relationships without subjecting people to brutal punishment for simply falling in love with whoever they agree to fall in love as adults. That paradigm of penal abolitionism is something that W.B. Du Bois called for in the Black Reconstruction. He called it abolition democracy. The same way that enslavement of Africans was abolished is the same way that other penal regimes that discriminate and target minorities and the poor can be abolished. And true to Du Boisian prophecy, lots of penal regimes have been abolished, not just the abolition of slavery, but you also have the abolition of or legalization of gambling. You also have the abolition of corporal punishment in schools, the abolition of the capital punishment, and more recently, the legalization of marijuana, letting prohibition laws wither away to allow more freedom to the people. Niels Christie, who worked in your department and was the author of Social Control as Industry. And he wondered where criminology would be if there were no crimes. I think somebody once said that it is easy to abolish crime by simply abolishing the criminal laws imposed by colonizers. But in this case, Niels Christie was talking about the family. Think about your family, guys. You were never punished for everything you did wrong in your family. Your family tended to forgive you more than would be expected from the criminal law. But even the criminal law itself agrees that children under a certain age do not have criminal responsibility. So the criminal law itself is also forgiving to that extent. We could retort to Christie when he talked about the fact that in family law, it is not criminal punishment that is preferred, but a nonviolent resolution of disputes and conflicts within the family. But we also know that within families, there is a lot of harm being done, and semiology could help us to understand such harm. As Christie does in some of his journal articles, like Conflict as Property, stolen from the victims by the state, he would always make references to non-Western societies, especially societies like Tanzania in Africa, to show that the victimized is still at the center of dispute resolution, whereas in the imposed colonial way of organizing criminal law with violence, with force, as Weber put it, you find that the victimized is silenced and can only speak through legal representatives and is discouraged from making long speeches or contributing to the hearing in court. And as a result, the property of the victimized, according to Christie, in the form of the conflict, is stolen from the victimized by the state. And according to Christie, we need to go back maybe to the village law, which existed in Europe before the punitive turn in criminal justice, also illustrated by another great alumni of your program, Thomas Mathiesen, who said that the modernist criminal law imposed by imperialism all over the world is fond of widening the net of criminal justice and thinning the mesh to make sure that suspects are not able to escape punishment. But we know now that as a result of increasing civility in parts of the world, some prisons are running out of inmates and are closing down, say, in the Netherlands, because they don't have enough people to put in prison. Some prisons are being closed. But Christie helped to pioneer victimology by demanding for the victims' voices to be made more central in dispute resolutions in the criminal justice system. This can be found in the work of Chinua Achebe, his last book before he died, There Was a Country, A Personal History of Biafra, where he said that the Biafra conflict was avoidable. The key combatants had met in Ghana and agreed that the dispute should be resolved without resorting to violence of any sort. But that agreement the Aburi Accord, it is called, was finally reneged on by the federal military dictatorship that chose to go to war and try to resolve it through violence with the support of the Labour Party government of the UK and the support of the Soviet Union that armed the genocidists and ended up in the killing of 3.1 million people, mostly Igbo, in 30 months. But African criminologists tend to shy away from a study of genocide that is being conducted by the imposed genocidal state, as Herbert Ekwekwe would put it, one of my former professors in Nigeria. Omale, who's with us today, Don Omale, Professor Omale was a former correctional officer and now a professor. He is investing his own research into restorative justice, perhaps because he saw the harm being done to prisoners under the current neo-colonial justice system that was imposed by the UK and retained by Nigeria. Also, Oko Elechi writes on Ubuntu and is very well known for advocating the nonviolent dispute resolution in African societies, where women play a significant role in resolving disputes in the community among the Igbo, but also, as we know, among the Zulu and the other South African cultures across Africa. Nonviolence is preferred. That is what Achebe called Mbari. Mbari is a mud sculpture of a house with figurines of people who represent different racial and ethnic groups from across the world, and different plants, species, different animals, and even spirit figures of the ancestors under one roof to signify, according to Achebe, that the African philosophy of coexistence and tolerance is alive and should be studied and advanced for the purpose of resolving disputes like the Biafra War that was unnecessary, that could have been resolved, and I would add, that could be addressed through reparative justice. Omale talks about restorative justice, but I don't think Omale has addressed the big elephant like the Biafra genocide or the Rwanda genocide that happened and long after the Biafra War. Kalonta Crompton, Anita Kalonta Crompton, whose first book I published in my series for Ashgate Publishers, where she talked about case making, in quotes, that when Black or African suspects made a case to reduce their guilt or to plead their innocence, that the courts didn't listen to them because of racism in the criminal justice system of the UK. But now she's focusing her research on intimate partner violence, and she has a chapter in our book on the Routledge International Handbook on Africana Criminologists, where she talks about intimate partner violence as going beyond physical violence to include verbal, psychological, and maybe financial violence. That is very common among different classes and different racial groups. They're very worrying in the sense that African immigrants are increasingly involved in the killing of their spouses, mostly by men against women here in the US. And maca, I think that's called maca, is called Mathilde. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the German name correctly, but she's called maca for short. I'm sure you guys are familiar with her work. Nagel is reminding us in her recent book, Ludic Ubuntu Ethics and the Decolonization of Justice, that we can marry the radicalism of workers who were breaking tools, the ludic, I don't know how you say that word, at the rise of capitalism, and marry that with Ubuntu philosophy from Africa to move away from the punitive turn and go back towards nonviolent dispute resolution. Even on terrorism, you have Dr. Onwudiwe writing on the globalization of terrorism. Again, that was a book that I published in my series for Ashgate, now being reissued by Routledge. And according to Onwudiwe, we can look at the globalization of terrorism as part of what is known as the global or the world system theory of capitalism, so that terrorism is a world system, not something that should be analyzed only within one country. That's the kind of work that I've been doing in my own research. My book that launched the Ashgate Publisher series on ethnic, gender, and class relations, in which Onwudiwe and Kalonta were published. Black women and the criminal justice system towards the decolonization of victimization.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, but we're running a little bit out of time. So
okay, don't worry then.
You could wrap it up for us. Sorry.
Oh, okay, don't worry. Let me just conclude my presentation by saying that all the work we are doing in Africa now, not all of it, but some of us, is in the line of critical histories of criminology in Africa. Dastile and I have just published a chapter on criminology in Africa, arguing for more of the critical aspects of criminology to be represented in the development of criminology in Africa, rather than simply retain the intellectual imperialism of simply studying courts, police, and prisons in the form of criminology. But just because we study in Africa doesn't mean we should ignore colleagues in Europe who are doing similar work, and the work of people like Steve Box in the UK would be very helpful to us, because Steve Box called in crime mystification, crime, power, and mystification for the study of the crimes of imperialism, not simply the study of street crimes. And I agree with Box on that. The chapter by Ago and Ibe in our Routledge International Handbook on Africana Criminologies is also very valid, because they're asking us to move away from corporal punishment in schools, something that was imposed by the colonizer, not just in schools, but also for adults, as paintings of Colony Belge will show us. And that kind of painting is the cover of Counter-Colonial Criminology, a critique of imperialist reason. All this will remind us again of Ngugi's demand that we should decolonize our minds in order to be completely free from colonialism and imperialism. Similar work is being done in New Zealand by Anje Descartes, who argues that we should use the term neo-colonial rather than the post-colonial, something that is influenced by Nkrumah's text on neocolonialism as the last stage of imperialism, or Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, that concluded that Africa and Asia should move away from the European model and develop our own models of justice. Kunin and Tauri on indigenous criminology, and Blagg and Anthony on decolonization of criminology is the kind of criminology I personally would like to see developed in Africa. And Vivian Salehana, who is a co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook on Africana Criminologies, talks about colonial systems of control, one of our books, and the ontology of knowing that Africa is still haunted by colonial impositions and imperialist dogma in the criminal justice system, when we should be decolonizing by abolishing even the category of crime, according to Salehana. Indigenous knowledge systems are also being developed by Chika Ezeanya Esiobu, who studies the Gachacha justice model in Rwanda, where she's a professor in one of the universities there. And Oriola is studying security in Africa with the aim of moving away from the colonial model to an abolitionist approach in the fight for justice for workers of oil companies, for example, who get kidnapped by resource activists in Nigeria. Thank you. I'm sorry to have taken so much time on this one slide, but from your questions, then we can delve more into some of these issues.
Thank you very much, sir.